guys, I am back on the road again today, heading up north for some wheeler dealers filming, but after another brilliant Grand Prix, loads of your questions to get through, so welcome to another Ask Elvis. Well, what a great race it was. I loved every single second of it because, you know, it wasn't all about wheel-to-wheel racing, which we did get a lot of. It wasn't about the calamity that we had in the Hungaroring. It was about strategic master plays, wasn't it? It was a game of cat and mouse at times. It was a game of kind of real intense battles, both in the cars but also on the pit walls and even back at teams' factories on another country. And I love that about Formula One. There's so many different facets to it, and I think in Hungary we saw many of them coming into play. So I did love the whole thing, and it seems that lots of you did too. What a great way to sign off for the summer break. So loads of questions. So we're going to start. In fact, we're going to start with these two. I've got my laptop out because I can't remember them all. We'll start with these two questions around pit stops. First one from Kurt Smith, who says, today we saw several dummy pit stops by Mercedes, for example. Is the crew informed in advance that it will be a dummy? Keep up the good work. Thank you very much, Kurt. So quickly to answer that one, no, the team definitely not informed it's a dummy. The idea is that if you are going to do a dummy, and I'm not suggesting that is what happened this weekend, but if you are going to do a dummy pit stop, you don't want to tell your team because you'll go out looking slightly half-hearted and it won't be looking like the real thing. So that's the first thing. Now the second part of that question, or a second question around the similar subject, from this one comes from Zhao Nobrega. He says, Elvis, dummy pit stops versus real pit stops. How to differentiate one from another? Teams can always say they had intent, but something came up last minute to change their minds. Mercedes do this time and time again. Well, first of all, do they do it time and time again? You have to remember, there's a couple of things here. Yes, a dummy pit stop can fool your rivals into making a call that perhaps they might not otherwise have wanted to make. That's the first thing. That's the reason anyone would do it. But you've also got to remember that two things. I think Mercedes genuinely were bringing their team out because they didn't know whether it was the right call or not. And so they had to be ready to cover it as an option. So that's the first thing. And the second thing is that Mercedes, you've got to remember, are the first team in the pit lane. Because of where their garage is, because of their championship position last year, they are the first garage that you come to after crossing the pit lane entry line. That means you get very little warning if you do want to make a pit stop between your driver coming in and getting the boys out the garage, boys and girls out the garage. So that's a slight caveat, I guess, for Mercedes in terms of doing it for them. But I just don't think it was necessarily a dummy. I actually honestly believe that Mercedes had, on the various calls, one was the Bottas nose change, wasn't it? I think they were, that's certainly not in terms of that's not a dummy because they're not trying to fool anyone else into doing anything at that stage. That's literally waiting for the right opportunity to do it. And these decisions are being made in split seconds. They are decisions that take an awful lot of conversation going on behind the scenes, as I say, both in Hungary, but also back at Brixworth and Brackley. Those teams back at base are having a huge input in every strategy decision, and sometimes they're not made until the very, very last second. And if you make a call at the very last second with your team as the first team in the pit lane, you may struggle to get them out and ready to, with the right tyres, the right nose cone in time. So I think it's fair enough to allow Mercedes and other teams, not just Mercedes, it's fair enough to allow them some leeway as long as they can justify that they were genuinely thinking about making a pit stop. And that can easily be proved by radio traffic and communications within the team. Halion Gaming asks this one. He says, does Red Bull's current performance prove Ron Dennis right, or do you think McLaren can get back to the front being a non-manufacturer team? I know technically Red Bull are not a manufacturer, but are the only company that Honda supply, counting Toro Rosso as the same company? Well, I think Red Bull's current performance is a lot to do with the combination of Red Bull and Honda. Let's look at Red Bull on its own, because even with a Renault engine, Red Bull was operating at a far greater performance level than McLaren were. And McLaren now have that Renault engine and are still, although much improved, not looking like winning races anytime soon. So let's not take too much away from Red Bull itself. But yeah, I totally agree with Rod. I do believe in the modern era of Formula One to be linked with a manufacturer and to have the resource and the full support of a manufacturer at that level is a massive advantage. It just helps you from everything from the continuous development that goes into your team's performance, but also the integration of that power unit from the very earliest design phase of your car makes a massive difference. That's why we've seen Mercedes be so dominant over recent years, because they've been very, very good at combining the power unit development alongside the chassis development. So if you have that kind of relationship with a manufacturer, then yes, you have a huge advantage. So I totally agree with what Ron said, and if you don't know what he was talking about, back in the day Ron said you can only win in Formula One if you are a kind of manufacturer team, and I kind of agree with that. So I think it's definitely a massive advantage. You still have to do the right things with it, because let's look at Ferrari. They haven't won anything for a long, long time, and yet they have exactly that situation. So being linked that closely with a manufacturer gives you the tools to do the job. You then as a team or as a partnership need to maximise it. Right, apologies if I get this name wrong, but Sotiri Bosmpoti, hopefully that's right, asks this one, two parts to this question. What do teams and drivers do on Sunday before the race? Does the waiting make people tense, or are they occupied so they don't notice? And two, is there any part on a current or older Formula One cars where the airflow gets squeezed to supersonic speeds? Would that be bad? So let's take the second part first. No, there is no part that I know of on a Formula One car, either modern or previous eras, where the airflow is squeezed to supersonic speeds. I just don't think that occurs at all. So no is the answer to that one. Part one though, what do teams and drivers do on Sunday before the race? Well, if it's a good weekend, if it's a smooth weekend, very little. In terms of the cars, what you're doing as a mechanic is you're making your final checks, you're perhaps bleeding the brakes, just having another look over it once it's opened up from or unveiled, have the cover taken off it on a Sunday morning, make sure there's no leaks. You do a series of fire-ups to start warming the engine up, you go through shift checks to make sure that the thing will run through the gears properly, bleed the brakes, as I say, any minor final changes which are allowed under part ferme conditions, mainly checking things. If you've got no problems, which is exactly how it should be on a Sunday morning, it should be pretty smooth, it should be pretty relaxed. And as a team member, you get to watch maybe the F2 race on the garage monitors. You'll generally be very relaxed, having a chat, having a coffee, maybe get some breakfast. There's nothing too stressful on what I might call a standard Sunday morning. It's when things are not standard, when it all becomes a bit panicky and things have to change, and that's when you're doing those checks and you find something that might not be right. Maybe you find a leak, maybe you find something, you do a fire up or a shift check, and there's a little blip on the data that highlights a potential problem. That's when things become pretty frantic and a very different Sunday morning. But generally, the drivers come in, they'll have a chat. It's just a very relaxed, very chilled out part of the weekend, and actually it kind of is the only period of the weekend that's like that, because Friday's busy all day and then you're busy all night. Saturday again, pretty busy right up to the end of qualifying when adrenaline's flowing up until that point. Sunday you come in and it's just utterly chilled and calm, as it should be. And then you have to find a way to build yourself up for the race, which naturally happens because the procedures that you go through tend to build that kind of momentum towards the point where you all leave for the grid. So in theory, it should be a pretty chilled out Sunday morning for most Formula One teams. Right, I've got to go and get onto my train now. As I said, I'm heading way up north to Durham, which incidentally, I used to live up that way when I was a kid, early part of my childhood. So back up north today, just for a couple of days to do some filming for the Wheeler Dealers Dream Car Show. Really looking forward to that, as I always do. So before I go and get on the train, Yeah, which is ready to board. One final question quickly in this part from Kirky Worky. Nice question. He says, Elvis, if you could bring back one team or livery from the past 25 years into F1, what would it be? Didn't have to think very long or hard about this one. It's definitely the 7-Up Jordan. Right, that was a long journey. I can confirm that Durham is a long way from London, especially when you are shoehorned into a carriage that's massively overcrowded and has got broken air conditioning. My goodness, that was not the freshest of carriages, I can assure you. Anyway, back on with the questions, because lots of you have asked and questioned whether Red Bull got their strategy right at the weekend. We saw a masterstroke from Mercedes, rolling the dice when they had the opportunity, of course, because they were sitting in second with Max up front. They had a big gap behind, a free pit stop worth of time, so they rolled the dice and it paid off for them. But could Red Bull have done anything to counter that? Now, pick this one from Glentz Joseph, who says, Red Bull should have rolled their dice too. Red Bull should have pitted Max around lap 56 or 57 when there was around 15 seconds and put on soft tyres. That would put him maybe about 7 or 8 seconds behind Lewis. Then Max has 12 or 13 laps to catch Lewis on the soft tyre. Max took fastest lap on softs. Right, is that true? Should they have done that? Now, lots of you are asking similar things around this, and I want to point out a few things. First of all, the reason Merc were able to roll that dice, as I said, was because they were in second. If they'd left it as it was, they may well have finished second. They were running up very close behind Max, but Max was defending hard, and that was building the brake temperature as well on Lewis's car. So the obvious thing to do, given they had a free pit stop worth of time behind, was to roll that dice, take the stop, put them onto a faster set of tyres to create an offset for the closing laps, and it would also help to cool down the brakes and allow Lewis to run in free air for a period of time. That's why they did it. Red Bull, first of all, did not have that opportunity, of course, or that necessity, because their brake temps were fine running at the front. That's the first thing. The second thing is, to pick up your point, Glentz, when you say Max took the fastest lap on softs, and lots of you said, given that Max took the fastest lap of the race by a long way on the soft tyres, surely he was so much faster on that tyre, that's what they should have done. It's easy to do that, or it's easier to do that over one single lap with everything turned up where you don't care about your tyre life. You've got a couple of laps to go, you're just going to give it everything and take everything out of those tyres. That's what Max did, got him the fastest lap. That would not have been the case had he had 12 or 13 laps, as you say, to try and chase down a very quick Lewis Hamilton on medium tyres that still had plenty of life left in them. Max would not have been able to sustain anywhere near that pace on the soft tyre without destroying them very, very quickly. Within 5 or 6 laps, those softs would have been destroyed running at that level. So the point was that Red Bull, at the point when Lewis made his pit stop, should they react? Should they immediately react and bring Max in? The answer to that is no, because Lewis, before his pit stop, had been asked to close right up behind Max for the very reason that it gives them the undercut opportunity. So he closed right up behind him, brake temp started to rise, they make their pit stop, they go onto a tyre that was easily 1.5 seconds faster. A fresh set of mediums, they come out of the pits, put the hammer down, and off he goes. He creates that offset and jumps Max. And even if he hadn't jumped Max on that outlap, it would have been pretty easy to do it, given that he was so close to him and had such a performance offset between the really old hard tyre that Max was on and the fresh medium that Lewis was on. So should Red Bull have then reacted? So no, they shouldn't have reacted immediately, because that would have been suicide. What do? Can't put him on softs at that point to create an offset, because he would never see the end of the race. If they put him on mediums, he knows he doesn't have a fast enough car. Lewis had the faster car of the two. So as soon as Lewis had track position, that was essentially game over for Max. So at that point, Max is now in the lead with a healthy, whatever it was, 20-second gap behind to Lewis at that point. But Max is on old hard tyres that have a limited amount of life left in them. Lewis is on the fresher mediums. And we know that that gap is going to start closing. So at some point, should Max have then pitted to try and counter that? And the answer to that is probably not, because Max is in the lead of the race. There are a number of things that could have happened to Lewis. He could have had a disastrous pit stop. when he made it. He could have been pushing so hard that he made a mistake. He could have gone off. He could have destroyed his tyres within a few laps by making mistakes and pushing so hard, which might have meant that he could have never then caught Max. When Max is leading the Grand Prix, he's in P1, he has optimum track position. It would be a very, very brave call by any team to pit from the lead of a race with the gamble that you can then get past your adversary, who you already know is the quicker car anyway. So the answer is, with a bit of hindsight, maybe, you know, a run late on softs maybe could have given them the opportunity. But there were so many things that could have happened to Lewis, which would have meant that if they had happened to Lewis, like a mistake, like a lock-up, like a bad pit stop, like a late safety car that could have easily come around a track like Hungary, well then Max is still leading the race and in prime position. So I think Red Bull made the right call. It was the only call they could have made, and ultimately they were just beaten by the faster car. Mercedes got it absolutely spot on. They had their opportunity and they took it. And incidentally, if you remember a little bit earlier on in the race when Lewis was all over the back of Max trying to get past, Max defending, you know, incredibly well, and Lewis went off wide, remember, at turn 4. If Lewis had got past at that point, well, the tables would have completely turned, and Lewis would then be leading the race on those hard tyres. Max would now be in P2 with a massive gap behind, and he and Red Bull could have then rolled the dice and gone for the mediums, and they absolutely would have done that. And the thing would have been very different. We had the same showdown, but in reverse order towards the end of the race. So unfortunately, the person who was in P2 held all the cards at that point in the Grand Prix, and there was very little that Red Bull could have done, given that they had a slightly slower car anyway. But there you go. I hope that answers the question. Lots of you asking about that. And ultimately, let's not forget, their race was hampered, both Lewis's and Max's to some extent, by not having a teammate in play. Both Pierre Gasly and Valtteri Bottas way out the picture, creating that huge gap behind Lewis. The Ferraris weren't in play either, and that's why the gap was there. Those two were having to race so hard. The pace at the front was just enormous, and that's why they ended up with a massive gap over everybody, because they were having to push just so hard. And that's why we ended up having to switch to the two-stop strategy that might otherwise have been a one-stop had they been able to manage that pace, knowing that there wasn't this free pit stops worth of gap building behind Lewis Hamilton. So there we go, that's that one. I hope that gives some clarity to it. I've now got to get out of it and go and do some filming, so I'll pick up with this a little bit later on. Ta-da! Right, back from filming. It's already 7:30, so apologies, I don't think you're going to get to see this on Monday night as normal. It might end up being Tuesday, I don't know yet, but I'm running out of time because I've also got to go and get dinner, and then I'm heading home again tomorrow morning. So I'll try my best, but I can't promise when you're going to see it. I'm going to rattle through a couple more questions just quickly before I have to head out. This one comes from Loftin, who says, why do many drivers only take one set of hard tyres for the whole weekend while they drive most of the race on these tyres? Shouldn't they practice on these tyres to learn pace and wear for the purpose of deciding on tactics? It's a really good point, and lots of people... Oh, phone's ringing. Hold on. That's better. It's a really good point, and lots of people have often messaged me and asked me about this kind of thing, because you often see on the allocation literally only one set of hard tyres for most drivers. The reason is that the hard tyre is the tyre they're going to go onto at the end of the race. They know that for most people you're not going to start on that tyre because you're going to start on the tyre that you qualified on if you're in the top 10, and either way you want to get a great launch off the line, and a hard tyre is a difficult one to warm up. It doesn't give you the most grip off the start line, where most places are there for the taking, most positions. So most people are always going to start on either the soft or the medium at most races, and certainly when it comes to qualifying, of course, it's always going to be about the soft or the medium tyre. So that's where most of the preparation goes in, through practice on Fridays and Saturday mornings. It's all around qualifying. When it comes to the long run simulations, it's about knowing how far you can go on the tyre that you're going to start the race on, the medium tyre, because everybody, or almost everybody, will plan to do a one-stop race. That's what's become the norm in recent times. And therefore, they know that at the end of the second stint, the second part of the race, they're going to be on the hard tyre. It doesn't really matter what performance it gives you, because they're going to be limited by what performance and longevity they can get out of the first tyre that they do the race on. So the hard tyre is not determining too much in the way of tactics, because they kind of got to use it. They've got to use it for the second stint. So the only thing that's really in their control and will shape their strategy is how far they can go and what performance they can get out of the two softer tyres. So that's the reason. It's too much taking out an allocation, taking out a set of soft or medium tyres from their allocation just to give you an extra set of hards to practice on, doesn't really gain you as much over the weekend as the actual practice and learning you will get from running on the softs or the medium tyres. Matt Bradford says, maximum fuel load is 105 kilos, correct? How many gallons or litres does that translate to? Well, it depends on temperature, and that's exactly the reason that they measure fuel in kilos in Formula One, is because if you measured it in terms of volume, in terms of litres, for example, it varies because, you know, with temperature. So to keep a consistent number, they measure it by weight. 105 kilos, I think, from memory, equates to around about 130 or 140 litres of fuel. I think that's about right from memory. Right, I may well get this name wrong. This Van der Tuin, apologies if not, was Max's race lost because of the failure of Ferrari and Gasly to put pressure on Lewis from behind? Well, yeah, to a large extent, as I mentioned earlier. If Gasly or Bottas or either of the Ferraris had been in this race, Lewis's opportunity to take that free pit stop would have not been there necessarily. Maybe not so around Bottas, of course, because he's moved out the way. But certainly with Gasly and the Ferraris, he would have shut down that window of opportunity, the pit stop window that Lewis had behind to make the free pit stop if they'd been in the race. So absolutely, that played a big part in Max's race, or Max losing the race. That's absolutely why he needs a teammate to be there to fight alongside him. A team is much stronger with both drivers at the front than they are with just one. Absolutely. Helga Kuistra, what in your opinion is the difference between Zandvoort and the Hungaroring? Length and layout look alike. Drivers seem to like the Hungaroring. Maybe the fear of lack of overtaking possibilities at Zandvoort is compensated by the layout like at Hungary. I tend to agree with you, Helga. I went to Zandvoort, I had a look around it myself, I went round it in a racing car. It's a brilliant, brilliant circuit. I love it. I love the way that it flows, the banked nature of the corners, the setting. It's just great. I love it. The problem that everybody is worried about is how wide the circuit is and the number of overtaking opportunities. But I would always say, let's get the race done. Let's see what happens, because Formula One drivers and any racing drivers, if there are limited opportunities to overtake, they will try and make those opportunities work. They will find opportunities. They'll carve them out of somewhere. They'll overtake in places that might have to be a bit braver. So let's not rule the race at Zandvoort out yet as a dull one, because yes, on paper it might look that way, but that's not necessarily how it will play out. I look at every single Formula E track as an example. I know they're very different categories, but every single Formula E track looks on paper like it should be a really dull place to race. Loads of 90-degree corners, some of them have very few overtaking opportunities, some of them very narrow. And yet we see some of the best racing because that's what the drivers are presented with, and so they have to find a way to make their way up the field. That's what racing drivers are paid to do, that's what they love to do, and that is what they will do. So I think, to everybody, let's just hold fire on criticising Zandvoort too much, and let's see what the race brings. Stradders says, hi Mark, I watched FP1 in Hungary and Bottas changed his engine, which made me wonder how much of the power unit is supplied by the manufacturer and how much by the team. The internal combustion engine, MGUs, batteries and turbo are all the same, but what about exhausts, radiators, gearboxes, etc.? Well, good point, it varies between manufacturers, but typically gearboxes are nothing to do with the power unit supplier. They will either come down to the team or an external supplier. Radiators will tend to be part of the team as well, and exhaust typically, although some manufacturers actually do now produce their own exhaust to go with the engine as part of the supply. So it varies from team and manufacturer to manufacturer, but I think typically what you're saying there is right. The exhaust, radiators, gearboxes tend to be a team thing, whereas everything else, part of the power unit, would be from the power unit manufacturer. Right, Kevin Vora says, "Hi Mark, with recent success that Red Bulls are having with Honda, what went wrong with McLaren? Did Alonso force them to change the engine, and wasn't Ron Dennis right about Honda?" Well, I touched on this earlier. I think Ron Dennis was right about Honda, and I certainly don't think it was Alonso that forced them to change the engine, but I just think they changed too early. They cut their tyres too early, and that's an easy thing to say, of course, with hindsight, now that they're doing so well with Red Bull. But they'd been through the hardest part, hadn't they, McLaren? They'd been through the pain of the early years of Honda. They were starting to see even just tiny shoots of progress. The problem with McLaren and Honda was that the relationship just broke down. It was destroyed. Whether Alonso played a big part in that, I don't know. I honestly don't know the answer to that. But I think once a relationship breaks down, it's a little bit like Red Bull and Renault. The relationship there had almost become untenable. And I think, you know, Red Bull had some success with Renault, but the relationship had broken down to the point where Red Bull certainly weren't the priority for Renault anymore. And if you want to win championships, you need to be the priority of your engine manufacturer, as we discussed earlier on. So Red Bull went to Honda. They've formed this new great partnership where things look rosy. McLaren have gone to Renault, and you know, whether that's a combination of McLaren not getting the car good enough, although they've made huge strides, and of course Renault not delivering enough on the power unit side, they are still struggling in terms of not being able to win races. But I think it was a relationship breakdown much more so than just a simple decision based on results. Right, let's finish off with this one from the Gingerbread Man. He says, "I just noticed Leclerc's rear wing was protected by a plexiglass plate just before the warm-up lap. Do you have any idea what that does?" Right, I saw this. I don't know if any of you saw this on the grid. As the Ferrari was sat on the grid and the mechanics were all around it just before it left for the warm-up lap, it's a plexiglass sheet that hung on to the front of the rear wing and basically filled the gap, filled the void in between the internal surfaces of the rear wing and above the crash structure. I do know what it was for, but I know lots of you have messaged me to having said that you've seen it on television. What was it for? It's basically there as a shield for the gearbox man who sat at the back of the car, the guy who, if they're using an external starter, sticks the starter up the crash structure tube to start the car, but he's certainly down there inspecting things. The car on the grid is being fired up repeatedly every now and again on the grid to warm it up, to circulate the coolant and the oil in the system, and that's being done periodically on the grid. Now if you're sat right behind that, right behind the exhaust, of course you get a face full of fumes and horrible stuff. So that plate is there to protect him and to give him the opportunity to still be able to see the chief mechanic who'd be at the front of the car calling the start up or giving him instructions. Often you see teams with a sort of material that flaps down, a kind of heat-proof material that flaps down to do the same job, but when you use that you can't see through to the front of the car. So the plexiglass screen is to do the same job, to shield the gearbox mechanic at the back, but also allow him to see through the visual instructions and keys coming from the front of the car. That's it. Right, I've got to go out for dinner. Oh, I also, earlier on, whilst I was on the train, I selected, using the comment picker, the random comment picker, I selected a winner for the prize from Multi21 Design and the GPBox.com. This is what it looked like. It's a brilliant piece of artwork, and the winner this week is Igor Zenko. Igor Zenko shared the preview video on Twitter. So thank you very much, Igor. You have used the right hashtag, and therefore you've been the lucky winner this week. This will be heading its way towards you very, very soon. Congratulations. Thanks to all of you that took part. I really, really appreciate it. I hope you all enjoy the summer break. I know for lots of you it'll be frustrating. Believe me, for the teams it is one of the best rules that has ever been brought into Formula One. It is much needed by this point. I'm not having a break at this point, so I will be back. I will be definitely bringing you more content, more videos over the course of the summer shutdown. Send me any suggestions for anything you'd like me to cover or explain or talk about, and I will try and get some of those done over the next couple of weeks. But if you are getting a break, enjoy it, have fun. If you're going on holiday, have a great one, and I'll catch you very soon. Cheers, guys.